The probe's antenna was still warm. That was the detail that stopped Fleet Commander Soverel mid-stride, 3 steps into the captured human vessel's communication bay. Not the destruction around it, not the shattered consoles or the scorched walls or the 4 members of his boarding team standing in the particular stillness of soldiers who have seen something they cannot categorize. The antenna. It had been transmitting seconds before their hull breach. Soverel could feel the residual heat through his environmental suit, a faint warmth against his palm that should not have been there, because the humans aboard this vessel had known, had known, that the fleet was coming. They had watched 412 warships drop out of transit space and form the largest coordinated battle formation the hegemony had assembled in 600 years. And their final act before the breach, before the boarding, before the end of any reasonable hope of survival, had been to send a signal. Not a distress call. Soverel's analysts confirmed that within minutes. The frequency, the encoding structure, the directional focus, none of it matched any emergency protocol in the human database they'd spent 11 years compiling. It was aimed inward, deeper into human space. He stood there holding the warmth of it in his palm, and for the first time in a decorated career spanning 42 years of hegemony expansion, Fleet Commander Soverel felt something he did not have an immediate classification for. He almost called it fear, then decided that was irrational. Then spent the next 6 hours wishing he had trusted his first instinct. The human they pulled from the ship's engineering compartment was not what the briefings had prepared Soverel for. The intelligence reports described human military personnel in terms that were clinically reassuring. Shorter lifespan than 6 of the 7 hegemony species. Pain tolerance rated significant but not exceptional. Psychological resilience described as moderate with notable variance. Strategic thinking ranked 3rd tier among spacefaring civilizations. The overall assessment, produced by the hegemony's most respected Xenological Institute, concluded that humans presented manageable tactical resistance with a low ceiling of sustainable conflict. The human sitting across from Soverel in the interrogation bay was bleeding from a cut above her eye, had clearly been awake for more than 20 hours based on the physiological markers his scanner reported, and was eating the nutrition block his staff had provided her, not because she had asked for it, not because she seemed grateful, but with the focused, mechanical efficiency of someone completing a necessary task. She was maintaining herself. That was the word that arrived in Soverel's mind unbidden. Maintaining asterisk. The signal you sent, Soverel said. Tell me who received it. She looked up from the nutrition block. Her eyes were brown and they did something he had not expected. They assessed him, not with fear, not with defiance, with the specific narrow attention of someone calculating. I don't know what signal you mean, she said. The antenna was warm when we boarded. Your encoding team transmitted on a frequency we have no record of. You sent something in the final 40 seconds before hull breach. She took another bite, chewed. Then you already know more than I can tell you. Soverel leaned forward. What you sent will not change what happens next. The fleet has already begun its advance. 42 human colony systems will receive formal notices of hegemony jurisdiction within the week. Your government has not responded to 3 separate. We responded, she said quietly. He paused. No communication was received from. We responded. She set down the nutrition block and folded her hands on the table, and Soverel noticed, in the way that details sometimes arrive before their meaning, that 3 of her fingers on her left hand had been broken and had healed at slightly wrong angles. Old injuries. Multiple. You just didn't understand what you were looking at. That sentence would take Soverel 11 weeks to fully understand. By then, 41 of his 412 ships would already be gone, and the question of who had received that signal would have become the most important unanswered question in hegemony history. But in that moment, in the interrogation bay, With the fleet still moving and the math still impossibly in his favor, he made the first mistake. He decided she was bluffing. Her name, the crew manifest said, was Warrant Officer Dara Vasquez, 29 years old, 7 years of service. Her file, translated from human military records captured in an earlier border engagement, listed her specialty as systems integration, a designation the hegemony's xenological team had interpreted as maintenance engineering. They were not entirely wrong. They were not nearly right enough. The fleet moved deeper into human space over the following 72 hours. Soverel monitored the advance from his command deck, watching the tactical display as 14,000 vessels of varying class and function formed the most precise coordinated maneuver the hegemony military had executed in a generation. He had spent 9 years planning this. The hegemony's expansion council had spent 30 years wanting it. Human space represented the last significant unincorporated territory in this galactic arm, resource-rich, strategically positioned, and occupied by a civilization that had, against considerable odds, managed to achieve faster-than-light travel without hegemony assistance or oversight, which the Council found philosophically inconvenient. The first colony system fell without engagement. The second fell without engagement. At the third system, a human defense installation fired twice with weapons that left perfectly spherical cavities in the hulls of 2 escort vessels. Not explosions, not penetration damage, but removal asterisk, as if sections of the hull had simply been asked to be elsewhere. The installation was destroyed on Soverel's order before his analysts could study it properly. He would spend months regretting that. At the fourth system, something happened that didn't fit the engagement model. Nothing fired, nothing fled. The human vessels in the system, 11 of them, various classes, moved into a formation that Soverel's tactical computer took 4 minutes to classify, and then classified incorrectly as defensive array. "They are not pointing weapons at us," his tactical officer noted. "Confirmed, their orientation is a pause. Sir, they're pointed at each other." Soverel stared at the display. 11 human ships, arranged in a pattern, each one facing inward toward the center of the formation. Each one, his sensors confirmed, broadcasting on the same frequency that the warm antenna in the captured vessel's communication bay had used 48 hours ago. What are they transmitting? The communications team worked for 11 minutes. Then, "We can't determine content, sir. The encoding is, we've never seen this structure before. It's not in the human communication database." "That database is comprehensive. We have 11 years of intercepts." "Yes, sir." A longer pause. "This encoding doesn't appear in any of them." Soverel ordered the 11 ships destroyed. It was the mathematically correct decision. He was still thinking in terms of math. All 11 ships fired at each other first. His fleet watched, unable to immediately process what they were observing, as the 11 human vessels coordinated fire on each other in what the tactical computer first classified as mutual destruction event, a possibility so outside the expected behavioral parameters that 3 of Soverel's senior officers vocalized disbelief simultaneously. But they weren't destroying each other. The shots were precise, targeted, and intentional, and when the dust of the exchange cleared, 7 of the 11 ships were gone, and 4 remained. Those 4 ships were structurally different from what they had been 60 seconds earlier. Soverel's analysts took 22 minutes to understand why. The 7 destroyed ships had not been destroyed. They had been cannibalized. Their components, specifically their drive cores and communications arrays, had been transferred at impossible speed, integrated into the 4 surviving vessels through what was later determined to be a pre-planned procedure the human crews had clearly rehearsed. The 4 ships that remained were not the same ships. They were faster. They broadcast more powerfully, and they fled toward the interior of human space at a velocity that his escorts couldn't match before Soverel thought to order pursuit. He stared at the sensor record for a long time afterward. They sacrificed 7 ships, his tactical officer said quietly, as if saying it aloud might help it make sense. They didn't sacrifice them, Soverel heard himself respond. They used them. The distinction, he was beginning to understand, was crucial. Dara Vasquez asked for a window on the 41st hour of her confinement. Not for psychological comfort, she was clear about that, with the flat directness that Soverel was becoming familiar with through the interrogation recordings he reviewed each evening. She said she wanted to observe the star field. Her people, she explained, navigated partly by visual stellar reference, an archaic habit that had survived into the modern era. His staff gave her the window. It seemed harmless. She spent 6 hours standing at it. On the 7th hour, his surveillance team noted that she had begun moving her fingers in a specific pattern against the viewport seal, not nervously, deliberately. They brought the recording to Soverel. It's a sequence, the analyst said. Repeating. We've been trying to match it to known human communication forms, Morse code, binary, semaphore derivatives. It doesn't match any of them. Could it be stress behavior? Psychological self-regulation? Possibly, the analyst hesitated, but the interval timing is too precise. She's not varying it. She's running the same sequence at exactly the same rhythm every 40 seconds. Soverel looked at the recording, at her fingers touching the viewport seal in that patient, rhythmic pattern. What's behind that viewport seal? He asked. A longer pause. The exterior hull sensor cluster for this section of the ship, sir. He was moving before the analyst finished the sentence, but not fast enough. When his team reached the sensor cluster housing 6 minutes later, they found that 3 of the sensors had been toggled in a specific pattern within the last hour. The sensors themselves had not been damaged. They had been used from the inside. She had been transmitting through the hull sensors, using a modulation method his team had never seen, by tapping the viewport seal at specific rhythms to create vibration patterns in the hull material that the external sensors were designed to detect, and that she had apparently worked out could be repurposed. The signal had already gone out. Direction, inward, deeper into human space. What did she send? Soverel asked. We don't know, the analyst said. The encoding is the same encoding as the worm antenna. Yes, sir. He went back to the interrogation bay. She was sitting calm when he arrived. He did not sit. He stood across the table from her and let the silence run for a full 30 seconds. You're feeding them our position, he said. She looked at him. I'm telling them you're coming. They already know we're coming. We announced our advance to your government 17 days ago. Yes, she said. That's different from knowing how you're coming. What does that mean? She looked at him for a long moment. You have 412 ships, Commander. I know you think that's a number that ends conversations. A brief pause. We've been watching you practice with those ships for 9 years, watching you drill the formations, watching the timing sequences, the engagement protocols, the communication windows. She tilted her head slightly. We're bad at a lot of things. We're very good at watching. Soverel felt it again, that thing he hadn't found the right classification for. You have no fleet capable of engaging. I know, she said. He waited. She didn't continue. She picked up the nutrition block and resumed eating. He left the interrogation bay with the specific, unpleasant sensation of a person who has asked the wrong question and knows it, but cannot yet identify the right one. The Hegemony's War Archive, declassified 2 centuries after these events and studied obsessively by military historians across 11 species, contains what analysts would later call the 7 hours that no one reported accurately at the time. It begins with a timestamp, 79 hours into the fleet's advance into human space. At this moment, the fleet occupied a corridor between the 4th and 5th human colony systems, having neutralized planetary defenses at both with what the post-action records describe as acceptable losses. 17 ships damaged, 3 destroyed, 1 missing, presumed destroyed. Presumed, that word would come back. What happens in the archive at that timestamp is not a battle. It barely resembles combat as the hegemony defined it. The fleet's navigational records show a course correction, a standard adjustment made at the recommendation of the Advanced Scouting Division, routing the fleet through a transit corridor, identified by hegemony survey probes as a faster path to the Fifth System's inhabited core. The recommendation came from a navigational analysis that Sovral's team had complete confidence in. Because the survey data was solid, the calculations were verified, and the corridor had been traversed by a hegemony exploratory vessel 18 months prior without incident. What the survey probes hadn't detected, because they were designed to look for hegemony navigational threats and humans were not yet a category of threat, was the network of signal relay stations the humans had placed throughout that corridor over the preceding 16 months. Not weapons, not defenses, just stations, small enough to fall beneath standard mass detection thresholds, sitting in the dark of the transit corridor and doing nothing that looked threatening. The fleet entered the corridor. The relay stations woke up. "Sir," the voice belonged to Sovral's communications chief, and it had a quality Sovral had never heard from her before. "Sir, we're receiving transmissions." "From the relay stations." "Through them. They're routing something, a signal from somewhere else, but they're amplifying it and sir, every ship in the fleet is receiving it simultaneously." "What is the signal?" A pause that lasted long enough to be alarming. "It's a voice, sir, a human voice, speaking in hegemony standard." Sovral was at the communication station in 5 steps. He put on the listening feed, and he heard it, a human voice, clear and unhurried, speaking in hegemony standard with a fluency that the briefing documents had insisted no human yet possessed. "Fleet Commander Sovral, my name is Admiral Petra Akafer, commanding the Human Defense Coordination. You are currently inside a network we built for you specifically. We have been watching your exercises for 9 years. We know your formation protocols, your engagement distances, your communication windows, and your commander's decision-making patterns under stress. We have one request." A pause just long enough. "Look at your ship count." Sovral looked at the tactical display. He had entered the corridor with 412 ships. The display read 401. He stared at it. His mind ran the calculation automatically. They hadn't been in any engagement, no enemy contact. The corridor was empty. He had reviewed the sensor data himself. 11 ships did not appear to be missing from any section of the formation. The remaining 401 ships appeared, to all sensors and visual confirmation, to be the complete fleet. The gaps simply were not visible. The formation had closed around them naturally, without any order to do so, as if the fleet itself had not noticed. The voice continued, "You lost 11 ships in the past 4 hours. You will not find where they went by looking at the corridor. We didn't destroy them, Commander. We borrowed them. The crews are safe. They'll be returned when we're done. We borrowed your ships because we wanted you to understand something before you went any further." And here was the moment that the archive records show Sovral standing at the communication station, completely still, for 6 seconds, which is a very long time. "We let you watch us practice. We built formations for you to study. We made sure your probes found the things we wanted you to find. 412 ships felt like a conversation-ending number to you. We understand that it's a large number." The voice remained calm, conversational almost. "But Commander, you counted our response in ships. We counted it in years. We've been building our response to this fleet since before your expansion council made its final decision. We've been inside your planning process longer than you've been inside our space." Sovral's hand found the edge of the communications console. "Warrant Officer Vasquez is fine, by the way. She did her job. You should let her go." The signal ended. 401 ships sat in a dark transit corridor, surrounded by the waking relays of a network built specifically for them, and Soverel understood, finally, with complete and terrible clarity, that he had not invaded human space. He had walked into it. He released Vasquez 40 minutes later, not as a gesture of compliance, though she was transferred via shuttle to a human vessel that appeared at the corridor's edge with timing that suggested it had been waiting, but because he needed her gone from his ship. The surveillance recording of her tapping that viewport seal with her broken fingers, transmitting in an encoding 11 years of intelligence work hadn't caught, had stopped being a data point and started being something else. It had started being a message about what kind of people he was dealing with. He called a command meeting. His senior officers arrived at the conference table in the state that follows the specific shock of discovering that what you believed was a show of force has been, retroactively, a performance requested by the audience. "They can't fight 400 ships," his tactical commander said. It was said with the tone of a person who needs to say it rather than a person who is confident in it. "They haven't tried to fight 400 ships," Soverel said. "That's the problem. The 11 missing vessels will be returned," they said. "Do we believe that?" Soverel thought of Vasquez eating the nutrition block, maintaining, the broken fingers long healed, 7 ships that weren't destroyed, they were asterisk used asterisk. 11 ships that weren't taken, they were borrowed asterisk. A signal encoding that 11 years of intelligence hadn't found, not because humans were particularly advanced, but because they had been carefully, patiently deciding what to show. "I think," Soverel said slowly, "that they are being entirely accurate and that we are not yet capable of correctly interpreting their accuracy." The silence after that lasted long enough that his first officer eventually said, "What do we do?" "We keep moving," Soverel said, because the Expansion Council's directive was not ambiguous, and because stopping in a corridor surrounded by human relay stations felt worse than advancing. "We maintain formation integrity, maximum sensor range, full communication logs. We document everything we observe." "And if they..." "We document everything we observe," he repeated. What followed over the next 18 hours was the most unsettling military advance in Soverel's career, not because of anything that happened, but because of how carefully nothing happened. The fleet moved. Human ships appeared at the edges of sensor range, not in formations that matched any tactical doctrine in the database, but in arrangements that Soverel's analysts kept reclassifying every few hours as their interpretation framework evolved. The human vessels did not engage. They did not flee. They moved precisely and deliberately in patterns that his tactical computer could not predict more than 11 minutes ahead. Every time his analysts believed they had identified the pattern, it changed, not randomly, with purpose. At hour 14, a human vessel came within engagement range of the fleet's left flank. Soverel's flank commander requested firing authorization. Soverel denied it. He denied it because the human vessel had approached in a manner that left it completely exposed, with no evasive capacity, and he had spent enough time thinking about what kind of people built a 9-year deception and encoded messages in hull sensor vibrations that he did not believe, for 1 second, that they had accidentally left a ship exposed. He was right. His flank sensors recorded, 15 minutes later, that the exposed human vessel had been doing something to the gravitational profile of a small mass body at the edge of the flank's navigation corridor. What it had done, specifically, would take his engineers 3 weeks to reconstruct. What they eventually determined, the vessel had very precisely nudged the mass body's orbit, by a small amount, one that would have been completely undetectable to standard navigational sensors. One that would have caused 17 ships in his flank column to have their transit jumps deflect off course by a significant margin, not into danger, just into the wrong coordinates. If Soverel had ordered them to jump from that position in the next 6 hours. They hadn't been positioning to attack the flank. They had been adjusting the road his fleet intended to use. They were editing the map, his chief navigator said, in the tone of someone who has just looked down and realized the ground is not where they thought it was. The question that replaced the one Soverel had stopped being able to ask, "Can we win this?" was quieter and considerably worse. How long have they been editing the map? The 11 ships were returned, as promised. They arrived at the fleet's position via a routing that Soverel's navigators described as geometrically elegant, which meant it was efficient in a way they couldn't immediately explain. The crew members aboard were unharmed. They had been given food, water, and this detail would appear in every subsequent account and would never stop being strange. They had been given 11 hours of access to human entertainment programming. Music, primarily. And something that translated imprecisely as recorded conversation archives. Their technical reports were exhaustive and largely useless because every system they had attempted to study aboard the human vessels had been politely and thoroughly non-functional during their stay. They had been guests. The hosts had been excellent. Nothing had been learned. Except by one engineer, who had not attempted to study any systems, because she had spent 11 hours listening to the music they'd been given and had noticed something. The music isn't random, she told Soverel. It's sequenced. The tracks follow a specific order that doesn't match any human cultural organization scheme in our database. It's not by artist, not by era, not by mood category. She paused. I ran a frequency analysis. The acoustic patterns in the sequence carry embedded information. They gave us music with hidden messages. Yes, sir. During the 11 hours, our people were aboard their vessels. Yes, sir. While our people were attempting to study their systems. They knew our people would be attempting to study their systems, she said quietly. Sir, I think the study attempts were expected. I think the music was the actual communication. Soverel sat with that for a moment. What does the message say? We've been working on the encoding. She looked at the data pad in her hands with an expression that he had started recognizing, the specific look of a person whose framework is being restructured around them. It's the same encoding as the warm antenna, same as Vasquez's hull sensor signal. And you still can't decode it. No, sir, but she hesitated. I cross-referenced the frequency of this encoding appearing in our surveillance intercepts, the communications we've been capturing from human sources for 11 years. And it appears 612 times, sir. He stared at her. 612 times in 11 years of intercepts, and it never flagged as significant because we classified it as interference. Noise. It didn't match any communication format we were looking for, so we filtered it. Soverel felt the cold, specific weight of a realization arriving fully formed. They've been communicating in our intercepts. For 11 years, sir, in the data we collected, we were carrying their messages. He stood up, walked to the viewport. The star field outside was the same star field it had been, but it was different now in the way that places become different when you understand they've been watched far longer than you watched them. How many of our ships have experienced any unexplained system events in the past 79 hours? She checked her data pad. The pause was long enough to be its own answer before she spoke. 287, sir. Out of 401. Yes, sir. What kind of events? Minor things, navigation calibration variances, communication timing irregularities, sensor refresh delays. She looked up. Nothing that triggered our alert thresholds, everything within acceptable operational variance. Everything within acceptable operational variance. He thought about 11 ships disappearing without any of the formation registering gaps. He thought about map editing and borrowed vessels, and a woman counting years while he counted ships. "They've been inside our systems," he said. "Some of our systems, sir, selectively. We can't determine the scope." "They've been inside our fleet," he said, and the difference between those two sentences, systems and fleet, was the difference between a security breach and something much older and more terrible. "Since before we entered human space." She didn't answer. The answer was already in the room. Soverel made his decision at hour 94. He recorded it in his command log with the specificity of a person who believes the record matters, who needs the record to exist in case something happens to him. He was going to request a communication channel with Admiral Petra Akafer. Not negotiation, not surrender. He was careful about that in the log. The Expansion Council's directive was clear, and he was not requesting cessation of the advance. He needed information. He needed specifically to understand the scope of what he was inside. The request was sent on every frequency in the human communication database. The response came back on the encoding he still couldn't crack, but it came with a translation this time, a gesture that felt deliberate, offered on their terms. "We'll speak when you've reached the 6th system. There's something there you need to see first." The 6th system. He moved the fleet. The 6th system's inhabited planet was called, in the human catalog, Meridian Station, though the word station was a colonial holdover that no longer reflected what the planet had become. 300 million people, a hub of human civilian infrastructure in this sector. The world his advance plan had designated as the primary administrative center for hegemony jurisdiction over human space. As his fleet entered the system, his sensors painted the full picture, and Soverel stood at his tactical display and understood what the voice in the corridor had meant by "there's something there you need to see." Meridian Station was defended, heavily, completely, by a defense network that hadn't existed in any of his intelligence, that hadn't appeared in any of the hegemony's 11 years of surveillance, and that was his analysts spent an hour on this, then two, composed entirely of the same relay station technology he'd seen in the transit corridor, but older, much older, and integrated into the planet's own infrastructure at a depth that suggested it had been there for longer than hegemony planning for this operation. "Sir," his sensor chief's voice, "the defense network were dating the installation." "Go ahead. The earliest components predate our first surveillance probes in this region." A pause. "By 6 years." Soverel closed his eyes briefly. "They started building the defense network before we started watching." "Yes, sir. Before we made the decision to expand." "The construction dates." Another pause, longer. "Sir, the dates suggest they started construction approximately 3 months after the Hegemony Expansion Council had its first closed session discussion about human space." And there it was, full and complete and impossible to recategorize. "We've been inside your planning process longer than you've been inside our space." The Expansion Council's closed session, the most secure deliberative body in hegemony governance. 3 months after its first discussion, humans had begun constructing the defense network for the system he was only now reaching. "How?" he said aloud, not to anyone specific. The question was too large for a specific addressee. But his communications chief answered it, because she had been in the corridor when the music message was identified, and she had made a connection Soverel hadn't yet reached. "The encoding, sir," she said. 612 times in 11 years of intercepts. We were carrying their messages." She paused. "But before we began surveillance, sir, before our probes, before our intercepts, they needed a different channel to carry messages through." He turned to look at her. "They used your survey vessels, sir. The hegemony exploratory ships that mapped this region before the surveillance operation began. We've been going back through the logs from those missions." Her voice was steady and careful. "There are anomalies, communication events that were logged as equipment malfunctions. They weren't malfunctions. She held up the data pad. Someone was talking through them. His survey vessels. 17 years of hegemony exploratory missions in this region. 17 years of communications, logs full of events they'd classified as malfunctions. They had been inside his fleet, longer than his fleet had known this region existed. Admiral Petra Akafer's face appeared on his primary display 40 minutes later. She was a small woman by human standards, older, with a stillness that reminded him of Vasquez eating the nutrition block, that specific, functional calm of someone completing a necessary task. She was in what appeared to be an underground facility. He noted the rock walls behind her. She had not given him her location. "Fleet Commander," she said, in hegemony standards so precise it hurt. "Admiral," he said, "I want to understand the scope of what's happening." "I know," she said. "That's why I gave you the 6th system first." "How long?" he asked. "How long have your people been?" "Watching you," she considered the word. "Since before we had ships, Commander, we watched you with telescopes. We watched you with radio arrays. We watched you through the behavior patterns of every civilization you'd already absorbed, because absorbed civilizations keep records and records travel, and humans are," a slight pause. "We are very patient readers." "You're in our systems." "We are in your fleet," she corrected, exactly as he had corrected himself hours earlier. "Selectively, we haven't interfered with your command functions. We wanted you to see the 6th system clearly." "Why?" She looked at him directly through the display, and he had the specific sensation of someone who was about to be given information specifically, because they could not use it to change the outcome. "Because you're going to go back," she said. "Not because we defeat you, not because we destroy your fleet. You're going to turn around and go back to the hegemony, and you're going to deliver a report that changes what your council believes about us, and that report is the only outcome of this advance that serves any purpose." She paused. "We've been preparing that report with you for 9 years, Commander. Everything you've observed, documented, experienced, we plan for you to observe, document, and experience it." He should have been angry. He cataloged the response and found it was absent. What had replaced it was something quieter and much harder to argue with. "The signal from Vasquez," he said. "From the warm antenna, what was it?" Akafer's expression changed slightly. "It was a status report." "What status?" She told him. And the thing the audience watching this reconstruction has been waiting to understand, has perhaps suspected but not confirmed, arrived in 2 sentences that Soverel recorded in his command log verbatim, because he needed them written down to believe them. The signal from the warm antenna was a status report on the hegemony fleet's formation patterns, specifically its communication window timings, sent back to a coordination center. The coordination center was not in human space. The coordination center was on a hegemony station, inside hegemony territory. It had been there for 4 years. "You have an operation inside our space," Soverel said. "We have many asterisk operations inside your space," she said, without apology. "Commander, the hegemony absorbed 6 civilizations in the last 200 years. We've been talking to all of them. They have a great deal to say." He stared at her. "6 civilizations," he said slowly. "You've been coordinating with absorbed species inside the hegemony." "For 11 years," she confirmed. "Since your expansion council's first closed session, we needed to understand your internal systems before you arrived. They helped. We helped them." She paused. "We're still helping each other." The thing he hadn't been able to classify, standing in that communication bay with the warm antenna, in the interrogation room with Vasquez and her broken fingers, at the corridor relay network, at the navigation corridor that had been edited before he arrived, that thing resolved, finally, into its correct form. He was afraid. Not for the fleet, not for the mission. The fleet was, he now understood, irrelevant in the way that a specific sentence is irrelevant once you understand the paragraph. He was afraid because he had arrived in human space with 412 ships and a plan built over 9 years, and the humans had not met him with an equivalent plan. They had met him with something he didn't have a word for yet, a plan built on a completely different relationship with time than the hegemony had ever considered. Not faster, not more powerful, just longer, more patient, more thoroughly embedded in the world it was trying to survive. "What do you want?" he asked. "The same thing we've always wanted," she said, "to not be absorbed." A small pause. "And for you to go home and explain to your council exactly why that's the more practical option. The council will send another fleet." "We know," she said. "We'll be ready." She looked at him steadily. "We've been ready for 17 years, Commander. We've simply been waiting for the right fleet to walk through and look at what we built." A pause. "You were chosen specifically. Your documentation protocols are exceptional. Your logs are thorough. Your reports will be read carefully by the people who need to read them." He heard it, the complete shape of it. "We were chosen," he said quietly. "You were the right tool," she said, not unkindly, "for the message we needed to send." The fleet went home. It took Soverel 14 days to write the report. Not because it was complicated. It was, in the end, simple in the way that things are simple once you've survived them. It was long because every section he completed revealed that the previous section required revision. His understanding kept updating underneath him. He filed it. The council read it in closed session. The proceedings were and remain classified. What was not classified, because it was observable to any hegemony vessel that passed through that region of space in the centuries afterward, was this: the hegemony never sent another fleet into human space. The expansion into that galactic arm stopped, permanently, at the border established by Admiral Okafor's relay network. There are official explanations: resource reallocation, strategic prioritization, a formal reclassification of human space as a complex diplomatic engagement zone, which is hegemony bureaucratic language for asterisk territory we decided not to explain. The unofficial explanation, the one that passed through hegemony military academies for the next 200 years, softened and abbreviated as such things become, but never fully disappearing, was simpler. Soverel's report contained, at its conclusion, a single paragraph that departing analysts said caused the longest silence in council chambers in recorded history. It read, "The humans did not defeat us. They understood us, and they let us watch them understanding us, and they made certain we had no possible response to what we observed that did not give them exactly what they wanted. We arrived with the largest fleet ever assembled, and we discovered that they had been building their response longer than we had been building our threat. They think in units of time we do not naturally plan inside. They sacrifice things we would not consider sacrificing, patiently, over years, in order to purchase outcomes that will not arrive for decades. They are not a civilization that can be absorbed, because absorption requires a ceiling on persistence, and I was unable, after 94 hours in their space, to locate any evidence that they have won." Dara Vasquez was promoted twice in the years that followed. She rarely spoke publicly about the 94 hours she spent aboard the Hegemony flagship. When she did, she said the same thing, that the hardest part was the nutrition block, which tasted terrible, and that she had broken 2 of her fingers the previous year in a training exercise, and they had healed wrong, and she was planning to have them reset when she got home. She said it lightly always, as if the other things, the broken fingers that gave her the hand shape to modulate hull sensors, the encoding that appeared 612 times in 11 years of enemy intercepts, the viewport, the 9 years of patience, the signal from the warm antenna that started it all, were not worth mentioning, as if what she had done was obvious. As if anyone, given enough time and enough need, would have done the same. The hegemony's expansion stopped. The 6 absorbed civilizations began a slow, long, complicated process that humans had been quietly facilitating for over a decade. A process the hegemony's history archives would later describe with the dry understatement of institutions confronting things they cannot fully explain as a period of unexpected internal renegotiation. And in the transit corridor between the 4th and 5th human colony systems, the relay stations that had woken up for 412 ships went quiet again. They did not go dark. They never went dark. They sat in the dark between the stars, patient and awake, carrying their encoding through the electromagnetic background of space, through any signal that passed nearby, through survey vessels and supply runs and diplomatic couriers, through the vast and ongoing conversation of a galaxy that had, for a long time, not noticed them listening. They waited. They had always been very good at waiting. The largest fleet ever built entered human space. It left having sent no further signals, not because it was destroyed, not because it was defeated, but because there was nothing left to report that Soveral's logs hadn't already documented more completely than any message from the front could. The hegemony had gone looking for a civilization it could end. What it found was a civilization that had decided, calmly and collectively and 17 years in advance, that it was not finished yet. And in the entire long history of species that had met the hegemony's expansion and been absorbed into its catalog of managed territories, not one had ever made that decision quite so thoroughly, or quite so quietly, or from quite so far ahead of the moment anyone else realized the decision had already been made. The antenna went cold. The war that never began was over. And somewhere in the underground facility with the rock walls, Admiral Petra Akafer read Soveral's final transmission, his formal withdrawal notification, language precise and painful in the way of documents written by proud people absorbing necessary truths, and she set it down, and she looked at the wall, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she sent a message on the old encoding, the one that had been in the intercept 612 times, the one they still couldn't crack. And across human space, and inside hegemony territory, and aboard 6 networks of relay stations that sat in the dark between stars, the message moved. It arrived, eventually, everywhere it was meant to arrive. No one outside those networks ever knew what it